Hello viewers and learners, Namaste. In the series of international relations theory, today I am going to discuss with you dependency theory in international relations. Dependency theory is broadly linked to the Marxist theory of international relations. It means that if we go by the arguments of dependency theorists, then they have a kind of economic critique of international relations or international system. Dependency theory developed in the late 1950s under the guidance of the director of United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, Raul Prebisch. Prebisch and his colleagues were troubled by the fact that economic growth in the advanced industrial countries did not necessarily lead to growth in the poorer countries, because generally we assume that if there will be an overall growth in the international system, then every country will get a benefit of it. Indeed, their studies suggested that economic activity in the richer countries often led to serious economic problems in the poorer countries. Such a possibility was not predicted by new classical theory, which has assumed that economic growth was beneficial to all, even if the benefits were not equally shared. It means that generally it was believed that when there will be an overall economic growth, then all the countries will get the benefit of it. Contrary to that, dependency theorists believe that in poorer countries, the economic growth was not that high in comparison to the developed countries. Apart from that, they even find out that the higher growth rate in developed economies is in fact responsible for the poverty in poorer countries. Such things were never explained by new classical economists. So this was something unique which was not explained by those who were betting for capitalism and globalization. Prebisch's initial explanation for the phenomenon was very straightforward. He said that poorer countries exported primary commodities to the rich countries, who then manufactured products out of those commodities and sold them back to the poorer countries. The value added by manufacturing is a usable product, always cost more than the primary products used to create those products. So if you see the trade relationship between developed countries and developing countries, then you will find out the countries that generally export raw materials, right? They did not get the higher price in comparison to when they send it to some developed country. Those developed countries transform them into some manufactured goods. So the gap between the price of raw materials and the manufactured goods, it was high, and the value added, the price actually goes to the developed countries. Therefore, they argued that poorer countries would never be earning enough from their export earnings to pay for their imports. And that is the reason they argue that generally in poorer countries, their export earnings are comparatively less than their imports. In fact, they have huge imports because they have to import almost everything from other states. Prebisch's solution was also similarly straightforward. So he suggested that poorer countries should embark on programs of import substitution so that they need not purchase the manufactured products from the rich countries, from the richer countries. Now here, what is the meaning of import substitution? So import substitution basically means that countries, whatever products that they import from other states, they should start manufacturing the same products in their own countries. It will help them decrease their dependency on other states. The poorer countries, he argued, the poorer countries would still sell their primary products on the world market, but their foreign exchange reserves would not be used to purchase their manufactured from abroad. So it doesn't mean that the poorer countries will not be able to sell their raw materials, etc., to international market. They will sell, they will keep on selling, in fact. But through import substitution, they can still minimize, the money that they have to spend for the purpose of import. But there are certain issues that make it difficult to follow. Now, what are those issues? The first issue is that internal markets of the poorer countries were not large enough to support the economies of scale used by the richer countries to keep the prices low. Here we can take the example of China. Not many countries can actually compete with Chinese manufactured goods. What is the reason? Because they produce those manufacturing goods at a very large scale. They are very cost effective, they are very competitive. Now if we expect the same kind of thing from a smaller country, then probably it will not be feasible. And that is the reason that even if you start manufacturing something in your own state, even then you fail to face the competition. Some countries, they have even provided some kind of support to their local manufacturers, but even in that case they couldn't sustain for long in the competition that they face from international bigger players like China. The second issue is concerned with the political will of the poorer countries as to whether transformation from being a primary product producers was possible or even desirable. It basically indicates towards the political will. So whether these countries, they have this kind of realization that this is something that needs to be done. They even have doubts regarding whether even it is possible. They may face numerous problems if they try to counter bigger players like China or like many other players in developed countries. The third and the final issue revolves around the extent to which the poor countries actually had control of their primary products, particularly in the area of selling those products abroad. Now it puts a question mark on the capability or the controlling power of the government over its own resources. Here we can take up the example of many African states where there is a lot of competition among the ruling elite classes. So they compete for domination, right? And the gap between the rich and poor is high. So the government is actually lacking the control over the natural resources of the state itself. In that case, whether the state can start a kind of business venture of their own or a manufacturing unit of their own where they can use those natural resources, etc., is doubtful, is questionable. These obstacles to the import substitution policy led others to think a little more creatively and historically at the relationship between rich and poor countries. At this point, dependency theory was viewed as a possible way of explaining the persistent poverty of the poorer countries. The traditional new classical approach said virtually nothing on this question except to assert that the poorer countries were late in coming to solid economic practices, and that as soon as they learned the techniques of modern economies, then the poverty would begin to subside. So here new classical economists, they are actually providing no solution to the poor conditions of developing countries and underdeveloping countries. So they have no solution as to why it is happening, right? They have no even answers exactly whether you can blame the international system or the terms of exchange, the nature of exchange for that, right? And what can be the long-term solution to this problem? Now that is fine that if you say that developing and underdeveloping countries, they have entered in that economic reform phase quite late. So that is the reason that in the initial phase they may have to face some problems. But that may not be a perfect answer to the poorer conditions of developing and underdeveloping countries. Marxist theorists viewed that persistent poverty is actually a consequence of capitalist exploitation. So here the Marxist scholars, they have shifted the entire emphasis of this economic relationship towards capitalism, and they believe that it is because of the capitalist exploitation that some countries are rich and some countries are poor, and the poorer countries are likely to remain poor because the structure is not going to change or the nature of capitalist exploitation is not going to change. Now there comes an important part in this dependency theory, and that is how we can define dependency. So dependency can be defined as an explanation of the economic development of a state in terms of the external influences, political, economic, cultural, on national development policy. This definition of dependency is given by Oswaldo Sankel. There is another definition which was given by Dos Santos, and he emphasized on the historical dimension of dependency relationship. He said that dependency is an historical condition which shapes a certain structure of the world economy such that it favors some countries to the detriment of others and limits the development possibilities of the subordinate countries. So this dependency is a kind of situation in which the economy of a certain group of countries is conditioned by the development and expansion of another economy to which their own is subjected. Now this definition is very important and it highlights the historical trajectory of certain countries being rich and certain other countries being poor. So there has been condition created, and under those conditions, whenever the rich countries they deal with poorer countries, right? Because of those conditionalities, terms of exchange, etc., and the nature of exchange, the poorer countries are likely to remain poor. Since those conditions persist, the situation of rich and poor also persist. There are three common features to these definitions if we analyze them. The first one is dependency characterizes the international system as comprised of two sets of states. Variously, it is described as the dominant or dependent states, or we can call them as center and periphery, or metropolitan and satellite. This thing has been broadly highlighted by the systems theory, which says that there is a division between the central countries, the core countries, and the peripheral countries. They have further analyzed that over the period of time, certain semi-peripheral countries or certain semi-peripheral states have also emerged that have played the role of a balancer in having those dependency relationships within the world system. The dominant states are the advanced industrial nations in the organization of economic cooperation and development. The dependent states are those states of Latin America, Asia, Africa, which have low per capita GNPs and which rely heavily on the export of a single commodity for foreign exchange earnings. So here a kind of description you can see where the relationship between the dominant states and the dependent state is described. It can be more or less understood also in the sense of the core and peripheral states. The second common conclusion that can be drawn is that external forces are of singular importance to the economic activities within the dependent state. It means that in dependent states, the economic activities are not carried or they are not planned or they are not implemented by the state themselves. Rather, there are certain external forces that dominate all those activities. They control them, or we can even say that they planned those economic activities. Now, these external forces include multinational corporations, international commodity markets, foreign assistance, communications, etc. Apart from that, there are different international economic organizations like World Trade Organizations, IMF, World Bank, etc. And they generally play in the hands of advanced industrialized countries, right? And those advanced industrialized countries, they further their economic vision or agenda with the help of these players. And that is the reason that the internal economic activities or the external economic activities in dependent states, they are largely controlled by outside forces. The third thing that can be drawn from those definitions is that the relations between dominant and dependent states are dynamic, because the interaction between the two sets of states tend to not only reinforce but also intensify the unequal patterns. It means that these relationships are not going to reinforce itself time and again, means remains permanent, but they will also intensify these unequal patterns in future. It means that maybe in future the gap between the rich and poor countries grows further. The gulf between the two, right? It grows further. And that we have also seen in the world, what has been said by dependency theorists. Moreover, dependency is a very deep-seated historical process that is rooted in the in the internationalization of capitalism. So with the internationalization of capitalism, this dependency relationship between the dominant countries and dependent countries, it got further perpetuated, right? It got strengthened, and in a way it kind of becomes a permanent feature of international economic exchange. One more thing that has been argued by dependency theorists is that dependency is an ongoing process. So it is not something that was there in the past which is not there in present, or something that is present today that is not going to continue in future. So dependency relationship was always there. So that unequal relationship of exploitation, of inequality, it persists. Latin America is today and has been since the 16th century part of an international system dominated by now developed nations. So here you can see the phase of colonization in between, that certain countries, they were part of the global economic system, but because of colonization or because of unequal relationship or dominant dependent relationships, their conditions were not as good as other developed countries. Latin underdevelopment is the outcome of a particular series of relationships to the international system. So the kind of relationship that Latin American states were having with the international system, it is because of that reason those countries are still poor. Dependency theory attempts to explain the present underdeveloped state of many nations in the world by examining the patterns of interactions among nations and by arguing that inequality among nations is an intrinsic part of those interactions. So dependency theory here try to explain the present condition of underdevelopment in many states by examining the historical patterns of interaction between rich countries or say dominant countries and between the dependent countries or say the poor countries. So what was the nature of their interaction? Who dominates the interaction? Or who decides the terms of the interaction? What was the nature of economic activity between in dominant states, and what was the nature of economic activities in dependent countries? Because of this, inequality actually persists. So because of the inequality, which was an intrinsic part of the interactions, that inequality also persists in their economic positions. Most of the dependency theorists, they argued that international capitalism is the motive force behind dependency relationships. It means here many dependency theorists, they blame international capitalism as the key guiding force behind those dominant dependent relationships. Andre Gunder Frank, who was one of the earliest dependency theorists, is quite clear on this front. He said that historical research demonstrates that contemporary underdevelopment is in large part the historical product of past and continuing economic and other relations between the satellites, underdeveloped and the now developed metropolitan countries. Furthermore, these relations are an essential part of the capitalist system on a world scale as a whole. Now, this interpretation is very important. Andre Gunder Frank argued that if you explore history, then history demonstrates that the underdeveloped position or the conditions of certain countries it is an outcome, or you can call it even a historical product of past. Now, how this thing becomes a reality? It is because of the nature of relationship between the dominant countries and the dependent countries, or between the core countries and the peripheral countries. He further said that this unequal relationship in international economic system or an international capitalist system, it is an essential part of it. It means international capitalist system is dependent on this kind of relationship between countries, or say among countries around the world. So that unequal relationship is we can even argue that it is a kind of core element of global capitalist system. So when we go through all these arguments, then we reach on some common understanding about the dependency theory. And in this first part, I have tried to explain the very beginning of dependency theory, like how it all started, and its ideological affiliation, from which ideology or like theorist it is influenced, its definition, and some of the common problems in some of the common outcomes of all the definitions, what has been explained, and also this thing that it is an ongoing process, and if you want to understand this dominant and dependent relationships, then it can only be done through thorough historical research. Thank you.